in the German campaign Stop Airbase Ramstein, and furthermore in environmental subjects within the German section of Friends of the Earth. My focus is the connection between military and environment. We have scheduled a 90-minute session, and the first part will be that within a time slot of, let us say, 45 minutes, we will give information, including to answer questions to our speaker. And in the second part, the other 45 minutes, we will have an open discussion. Before I give the word to our first speaker, I will make a very small introduction with 2 slides. A moment. Okay, I think you can see it. What's the subject we are talking about? We see the different effects of military, and we can say military is killing not only in case of war. The killing of military starts with the waste of resources, and one main effect of militarization is the immense, the huge amount of resources, equipment, fuels, and things like that. And of course, when we talk about war, we can say this is fast killing of people and destruction of buildings, environment, and infrastructure. And we have also the effect of what I would say long-term killing, silent killing, because of damages in the environment, pollutants in the air, soil, water, and food chain. And here we have a lot of subjects, and of course we can only give a very comprehensive overview what we talk about. Main examples are fuel of sunk warships on the seabed, the dumping of ammunition in the sea. One comparatively new topic is the knowledge about firefighting foams with PFAS, fuel dumping from aircraft, chemical weapons remains, and uranium ammunition after warfare, and nuclear waste. But before we talk about all these subjects, the first we will talk about the effects of military to greenhouse gases and global warming. And Tamara Lawrence will start as the first speaker. Tamara is member of the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace and scientific researcher on a university. And it's interesting, she will talk about things linked to the Canadian political situation. And I may say most of these things are very similar in Germany. When you're talking about new fighter jets and the missing link to climate change. Tamara, it's your turn. You can start.
Good morning, everybody from Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. I am speaking to you today from the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the neutral peoples of the Grand River across Canada and around the world. The land of Indigenous peoples have been stolen, occupied, and contaminated by the military. So I would like to show you a presentation. I'm going to share my slides with you.
Okay, success. It's working.
That's great. So I am a longtime environmentalist and peace activist. I have been working on the problem of military emissions, the military's impact on the climate for about 15 years. 7 years ago, I worked as a researcher with the International Peace Bureau. And while I was at the IPB, I wrote a report called Demilitarization for Deep Decarbonization, Reducing Militarism and Military Expenditures to Invest in the UN Green Climate Fund and to create low carbon economies and resilient communities. This report is still available on the IPB website, and the recommendations in that report are still pertinent. In 2014, I spoke on my report in New York City for the People's Climate Summit, and I participated in the big climate march in Manhattan. In that march, Veterans for Peace had a huge float, and you can see it in the picture. It said the Pentagon is the largest consumer of oil. And so there's a picture of me in front of that float. In my presentation today, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the latest climate science and put military emissions in that context. I'd also like to share briefly with you some of my PhD research. I'd like to explain why NATO is one of the greatest threats to the climate. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about our campaign in Canada to stop the Trudeau government from buying new fighter jets. And finally, I will close with some resources and some ways we can take action. So last month, the United Nations Environment Programme released two important new reports, the Emissions Gap Report in December and the Adaptation Gap Report in January. In the Emissions Gap Report, UNEP said the climate crisis is getting worse. 2020 is on track to be one of the 3 warmest years on record. And this period, 2011 to 2020, will be the warmest decade on record. It also stated, even more worrying is that based on current pledges under the Paris Agreement, the world is heading for at least 3.2 degrees Celsius temperature rise in this century, which will only intensify floods, droughts, storms, wildfire, and locust plagues. In the Adaptation Gap Report, that came out this month, UNEP said nations must urgently step up action to adapt to the new climate reality or face serious costs, damages, and losses. UNEP also said that all nations must pursue efforts for a green pandemic recovery, and they must update their nationally determined contributions that must now include new net zero commitments. So let's think about this climate science as we move forward in my presentation. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about my PhD research now. So I am focusing on the overlooked issue of military emissions and exemptions in global climate governance. And I'm also dealing with the issue of offsets in military emissions as governments try to engage in carbon-intensive defense procurement, such as buying new fighter jets, while they're trying to pursue net zero climate policies. I'm also looking at how much of the remaining global carbon budget will be allocated to Western developed countries with with big militaries. We have about 320 gigatons of CO2 that we can burn and keep global mean temperature rise below 2 degrees Celsius. So we have only a little bit of carbon that we can burn, and protect the climate. So I'm also questioning, how countries can apply the Paris Agreement principles of accountability, transparency, justice, and equity to their military emissions. How is it equitable that big Western militaries like Canada and the United States are using so much fuel to power their fighter jets and their warships when poor developing countries don't have enough resources to turn on their lights? Now, as you know, the military is the state's most powerful carbon-intensive institution. The US military is the largest institutional consumer of fossil fuels in the world, and it is also the largest landholder in the world, with over 800 bases in about 70 countries. In my country, Canada, among all federal agencies, it's the Department of National Defense, our military, which consumes the most fossil fuels and also has the most real estate and the most infrastructure. Yet, under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the agreements, countries do not have to fully report and reduce their military emissions. The 1997 Kyoto Protocol exempted international bunker fuels that is used by the military. Under the 2006 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change guidelines, countries don't have to fully and transparently report their military fuel consumptions and carbon emissions, as there are clauses for confidentiality because of national security. And though the 2015 Paris Agreement does not give an explicit exemption to the military, it allows countries to determine their own voluntary nationally determined contributions for emission reductions. So in countries like the United States and in my country, Canada, the military as a sector is exempted from our national greenhouse gas reduction plans. So these exemptions give the military an unconstrained claim to pollute the global atmosphere, which is a global commons. So from my research, I am also convinced that NATO is one of the greatest threats to the climate. And this is because the alliance is dangerously diverting our attention and our resources to war and militarism instead of focusing on the greatest existential crisis that we're all facing, which is global warming. The 30 NATO states currently spend about $1 trillion combined every year on defense, which is about 50% of global military spending. And at the 2014 NATO summit in Wales, all the NATO members made a commitment to spend 2% of their GDP on defense by 2024. And of that amount, 20% needs to be spent on equipment to stay interoperable all of the NATO members. They have to constantly upgrade their military capabilities. Yet fighter jets, attack helicopters, warships, light armored vehicles, they're all petroleum powered, and they are notoriously energy inefficient. So NATO traps us into carbon intensive militarism for years to come. And it's going to get worse. Last year in June, the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg announced NATO 2030, a new plan and a public relations campaign to expand the alliance geographically, politically, and financially over the next 10 years. Yet this is the decade that is absolutely crucial for us to tackle the climate crisis. NATO members instead are modernizing their weapon systems, and they're engaging in provocative military exercises and operations which use a lot of fossil fuels. So here's an example. The most expensive weapons program in human history is Lockheed Martin's F-35 fighter jet. And this is the main new combat aircraft for the alliance. It is estimated that the United States is going to spend over $1.4 trillion for the acquisition and life cycle costs of about 3,000 F-35s. Already Australia, Belgium, Denmark, Italy, the Netherlands, Turkey, United Kingdom, and others have spent tens of billions of dollars to buy hundreds of new fighter F-35s. Now, Germany and Canada might also buy them as well. In 2019, the Canadian government launched a $19 billion competition for 88 new fighter jets. In the running are the Lockheed Martin F-35, Boeing Super Hornet, and Saab's Gripen. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has said that Canada will pick the new fighter jet in early 2022, so next year. If Canada buys these new fighter jets, though, it will mean that we have to keep pumping oil from the ground. We should think of fighter jets as pipelines in the sky. They will cause carbon lock-in for the next 4 decades. Fighter jets like the F-35 will prevent Canada and all of the other countries within NATO from rapidly decarbonizing and meeting their Paris Agreement targets by 2030 and from decarbonizing by 2050. The Canadian government has not yet signed a new contract, and we want to stop this purchase. So last summer, activists across the country, we launched a campaign, no new fighter jets, and we've been putting intense pressure on the Trudeau government to stop this purchase. I would also like to share some resources on the problem of military emissions with you. I don't have enough time in my presentation to go in detail on these reports, but I'd just like to bring them to your attention. I encourage you to read the 2019 Costs of War project entitled Pentagon Fuel Use and Climate Change. It's from Brown University, and they have some really great calculations on different military vehicles and their carbon emissions. Last year, Dr. Stuart Parkinson from the Scientists for Social Responsibility released a study entitled The Environmental Impacts of the UK Military Sector, which is excellent. You know, very sadly, Boris Johnson just a couple of months ago announced a $16 billion increase to the UK military budget. Last year, the Institute for Policy Studies based in Washington, D.C. published a great online report called How Militarism Fuels the Climate Crisis and Vice Versa. No warming, no war. It has many helpful infographics, and I encourage you to have a look at it. Now, the Institute for Policy Studies argues that true climate solutions must have anti-militarism at the core. Rapid decarbonization and a Green New Deal are just not possible with rising military expenditures and military emissions. If we are serious about the climate emergency, we have to have a parallel process of disarmament and demilitarization alongside of climate adaptation and climate mitigation. We have to have the courage to say NATO must be abolished. NATO is impeding global cooperation on solving our common global challenges, which are the climate crisis, the pandemic, and poverty. And finally, we need conversion from our highly militarized economies to a green and peaceful economy. We need a just transition that is also a peaceful transition. So 2 reports show us how we can pursue conversion. One is from the campaign against the arms trade in the UK. It came out in 2014 and it's called Arms to Renewables. It's really good. And the other one came out very recently by the US ICANN group, and it's called Warheads to Windmills. This is from the 2014 New York March. I was very pleased to see these signs, windmills, not weapons, and those are the kinds of signs that we need to have in the next big global climate march, which is, and climate action, which is on March 19th of this year. So we absolutely need to militarize, to decarbonize. This is a campaign that the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace launched about 10 years ago, and we've been trying to lobby other environmental groups to join our campaign and to put pressure on the federal government to take seriously the issue of military emissions and exemptions and offsets. So I'm looking forward to your questions and for the discussion. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Tamara. Okay, are there any direct questions to Tamara?
It was very convincing.
I agree. Yes, I could add that the Finnish government is also trying to, or is going to buy new fighter jets. This time 60 of them, or 64, somewhere in that between. And also here, F-35 is one of the front runners. The decision will be taken already at the end of this year. So we will be before you Canadians in wasting our money on these completely unnecessary objects.
What I can add concerning fighter jets, we have in Germany a similar discussion, because our Ministry of Defense wants to order F-18 jets in the USA because of the certain capabilities to transport nukes. And actually, it's a very huge discussion. You know, last Friday, the treaty to ban nuclear weapons is officially in operation. And more the question is, why must we spend billions of euros for fighter jets for the only purpose to give Germany the nuclear share to the US atomic capabilities? Okay, perhaps you can.
You know, when we want to continue discussing a little bit, the interesting question is, why are Germany, so normally the best friend of the military industry of the United States, was not buying the F-35? The argument is definitely not a disarmament argument. The argument is the European concurrence. The Germans are developing, together with France and the support of Italy and Spain, now the European air fighter, which is tremendously expensive, but it is the concurrence to the United States. And that is the only reason that the Germans are not buying F-35, but because they are developing their own fighters. So same fights Tamara is describing, we have on our own ground or on our own soil in our own country. So we definitely have to connect our common activities. So Karl-Heinz, the next one.
Okay, then we should go on to Klaus Monton. He is a retired lecturer in theoretical physics at the University of Helsinki and member of Technology for Life in Finland and treasurer of INES, the International Network of Engineers and Scientists for Global Responsibility. And he will give us a very comprehensive overview about the environmental and human health impacts of military.
Okay. So if I am allowed to share my screen.
Okay. Where is it?
Just a moment. You should be allowed to do it, Klaus. Try it.
Yes, do you see my screen now?
No, not yet.
Oh. Wait.
No, you have the right to be a co-host. You should also
Yes.
have the right to share.
You could do it yourself.
Not
On the bottom line, the middle.
Yes,
screen.
I know. I have pressing it several times and nothing happens. Oh, yes.
Yeah, danke.
One participant can share at a time.
Yeah, but there's no one sharing.
Yeah, that's right. You still don't see it.
No.
Uh,
Maybe I try to share it and to stop it. Maybe there's something wrong, and then you can try it again. I have actually no other idea. Can you see now my screen?
yes,
Then
I can. Yes.
Stop sharing. So
And now
now try it again. Close.
share screen. Now, do you see it?
Hi, Klaus. Not yet. So you know how you have this green emblem down on your computer?
Yes, I'm.
And then there is an image that pops up where you basically have to choose which part of your screen you want to share. Because if you have like multiple windows open, it asks you which one do you want to share.
Yes,
So
I know. Yes,
okay.
I see, and I have done it.
I'm sorry. I'm just trying to figure out what the problem is, because from a technological perspective, it should be fine. No, I think now it's happening. Yeah.
Yes.
Very good, very good, very good. So, thank you very much for the invitation to join this webinar. I'm giving you 3 cases of environmental disasters caused by the military. There are 3 cases that have very large scale impact and also very long-term impact. So in Karl-Heinz's words, they are very much silent killers. So, and of course, since the TPNW entered into force last Friday, I will start with something related to nuclear weapons, namely the impact of nuclear weapons tests. Now, since 1945, some 2,500 nuclear devices have been exploded, 2 in a war, and there have been more than 2,000 tests. And so in some tests, several devices were exploded at once. Out of these, 520 were so-called atmospheric tests. That means that they were conducted on the surface of the Earth, in the atmosphere, or underwater. And this means that all the radioactive fallout, actually 100%, was distributed into the environment. The last atmospheric test was conducted by the Chinese in 1980 in the Gobi Desert. Now, these tests have been conducted all over the world. I have listed some of these more well-known places: Semipalatinsk nowadays in Kazakhstan, Novaya Zemlya in present-day Russia. In the United States, have conducted in their own test site in Nevada, but also in the Pacific, in the Marshall Islands and on Christmas Island. The UK has tested in Australia, French in Algeria, and in the French Polynesia, and so on and so on. So they have really been all around, and that has led to the fact that the fallout from these tests has also been globally distributed. There is no place on Earth, not even on the Antarctica, where you cannot find traces of the fallout from these tests. It's said, of course, the atmospheric tests are the worst polluters, as I mentioned. Nowadays, tests are done underground. Also, the North Koreans do their testing underground, but they are not free from pollutions. So-called vents, I mean, there are always channels in the surface of the Earth admitting gases and debris from the underground explosions to come to the surface in so-called vent events. And here I have a picture from one that went very bad. That is from the Nevada test site. So underground tests do also generate fallout, not just the atmospheric tests. So what is then the inheritance from all of this activity? Of course, the test sites are still extremely dangerous places because of the radioactive fallout that has been deposited there. There are some elements, the so-called transuranium elements, that are created in the fission or in the process of that takes place in a bomb explosion, and which have very long lifetimes. And the worst one is, of course, plutonium, which will be there for hundreds of thousands of years. And of course, if you get plutonium inside your body, that is very, very dangerous. And as you were, you are well aware, I think, that we have many examples of accidents in connection with nuclear tests. People have been submitted either deliberately, like the soldiers who were being trained to withstand battlefield nuclear weapons, or accidentally, like the Japanese fishermen in the bikini test. Also, another fact is that indigenous peoples have been removed from their traditional homes in order to make place for these tests. There are the people in Australia, Aborigines in Australia, Berbers in the Sahara, and the Marshall Island people. And these test sites, and for instance, the worst one, polluted one, is probably one in Palatinsk, Semipalatinsk, but here I have a picture from the Eniwetok Atoll in the Marshall Islands, where the blue thing here is the crater of a test explosion, but below it you see the so-called nuclear dome, a pit where lots of highly radioactive nuclear debris has been collected and then capped with a concrete top. However, this top is now being falling apart, and there is a great risk that the contents will leak out of this nuclear dome. Now, as I said, some of the fallout is very long-lived, and that means that one has proposed, geologic researchers have proposed that the new geological era, which is called the Anthropocene, will be the suitable marker for the beginning of the Anthropocene will be the remnants of the nuclear tests, which, as I said, are global. They are everywhere, and they are easily identified, and they can be dated very accurately on a geological time scale. So that is a very suitable marker. And of course, once the transuranium elements have decayed, even then there will be the fission products and the very telltale isotope composition of these, which will be there forever. So this is a typical, very long time, one could say eternal remnant of how military activity has changed the Earth. Now, my second example will be chemical weapons dumps. They occur in the seas all over, also over the place. I have listed some of them here. There are lots of them in the Irish Sea, that is the sea between Ireland and the Great Britain, in the Mediterranean, in the Atlantic, outside Halifax, in the Pacific, outside Hawaii, and also outside Japan, where the Japanese chemical weapons were dumped. In the North Sea, there are already dumps from First World War chemical weapons outside the Belgian coast, and then in the Skagerrak, which I will be talking lots about later, and the Baltic Sea are examples. And I will mainly discuss here the examples close to my home, and that is the Baltic Sea and the North Sea Skagerrak dumps. It is, although all the warfaring nations in the Second World War had large amounts of chemical weapons, only the Japanese actually used them in the warfare. And fortunately for us Europeans, they were not used here. After the war, there were these large amounts of chemical weapons that the Germans had stored, and also surplus Allied chemical weapons. that had to be got rid of. So there is the Allied made a rather thorough search of what was available in Germany and found something short of 300,000 metric tons of chemical weapons. And they had to then be destroyed or dumped. And most of it were dumped into the sea. And in Skagerrak, some 170,000 tons of chemical weapons were dumped. In the Baltic Sea, 50,000 tons. Now, the Baltic Sea is, of course, a very shallow sea. It's heavily polluted anyway by both industry and by agriculture. So these extra 50,000 tons of chemical weapons is certainly not a welcome addition. What kinds of weapons were dumped? Most of it is mustard gas, but also nerve gases, agents like taboon, sarin, and soman. Now, let me show you where these dumps are. So here is a map of the southern part of the Baltic Sea and the part of the North Sea that comes in between Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. So the Skagerrak dump is in two places, one outside the Norwegian coast and one outside the Swedish coast, or between Sweden and Denmark. The Baltic dumps are, there is some in the close outside Kiel and Flensburg, but the main dumping sites were the Bornholm Basin. Bornholm is this island here, it belongs to Denmark, and the Gotland Deep, so-called Gotland Deep, which is south of the island of Gotland, which is here and which belongs to Sweden. Now, it was planned that these two dump sites should be mainly used, and the route that was to be used was this with this dotted line here. But one can, since one has found chemical weapons on the seabed along this route, it must be that some of the things were dumped already before they reached the real dumping grounds, presumably just to save time. And also the fact that we found or chemical weapons have been found here and here showed that presumably some ships took a shorter route, which was not really allowed because this interferes with the commercial shipping lanes. Then a rather big unofficial dump apparently happened here in the so-called Gdansk Deep. And also further north, there have been, one has found these chemical weapon dumps. Now, they were either loaded into ships, which were then scuttled, so the whole ship was sunk with its cargo of chemical weapons. And here is a picture of one of those wrecks in the Skagerrak. This is a very well preserved wreck. Most of them have actually broken apart, and that means that the weapons that were in the holds have been able to disperse on the sea floor. This way, this method of dumping and sinking of total ships was mainly used in these Skagerrak dump sites, but also the weapons themselves, that means they are artillery shells, they are aircraft bombs, but also just canisters of these chemical agents were just thrown overboard. And here is a picture of such thing where you can see artillery shells containing chemical weapons on the seafloor directly. So these are quite large amounts of harmful stuff that was disposed of in this way. And now, since this was done in the end of 1940s, beginning of 1950s, these canisters have now corroded and are leaking. And the main problem is here the mustard gas, because it remains stable on the seabed in the marine environment, whereas these nerve agents are will be hydrolyzed quite quickly and will not be that dangerous. Now, to whom are these weapons dangerous? Mainly so far to fishermen, especially those who are using trawls, which go trawl the bottom of the sea. There have been many incidents reported over the years, and some bad injuries, especially from mustard gas, which has escaped from, apparently escaped from canisters containing it. The mustard gas itself, although it's called a gas, it's not a gas, it's kind of a jelly-like substance. And lumps of this jelly substance has been caught in nets and then taken up on ships, and fishermen have been badly maimed by it. It's of course also a danger for all marine construction work, pipelines, and of course the North Stream is pipelines is a topical example of that. One had to remove or first choose routes for these pipelines were away from these known dump sites, and then when chemical weapon remains were found, it had to be removed. Also for submarine cables, of other building projects like offshore wind farm or the tunnel that is projected between Germany and Denmark now, has to take into account the dumps in the so-called Lilla Belt. Now, what has been done? This problem, although, for instance, also Ines organization pointed out the danger from this already in the 1990s. The main action has been started only this millennium. There have been several projects of where the countries joining the Baltic have joined force, and these projects have enjoyed support from the European Union, the ChemSea, Daemon, and Daemon 2. Daemon 2 is the one that is still going on. They have established databases of what there is, what kinds of chemical weapons is there, where they are. They have developed a so-called Ecotox toolbox. That means that if you catch by mistake or by design, you try to remove them, you know what to do. I mean, it's a kind of a list of topics that you have to take care of, and a list of topics that have to be done in this and how they should be done. Also for the official in the various countries, there are decision support systems, so that when they receive reports on catches of chemical weapons, they know what to do. And of course, those who work on the sea, fishermen, sailors, and marine construction workers, they have to be trained so they know what to be aware of and how to react And of course, lots of research has to still to be done, because the metabolism of these chemical agents in a marine environment is not very well known. It's not very well known how different living organisms take up these substances, and how they are then moved further up in the food chain, and eventually then also in fish that people, or shellfish that people eat. So this is what is going on, and I know this from colleagues at the University of Helsinki, which are involved in these activities. My third example is a very well-known one, and that's the use of defoliants, that are chemical agents that are designed to strip deciduous trees of their leaves. This is a British invention by the Imperial Chemical Industries, and it was used by the United Kingdom in Malaya, when that was still a British colony, for basically in the 1950s. But the most well-known case is, of course, the use in the Vietnam War, where the Americans called this stuff Agent Orange, and it was used during most of the war in the so-called Operation Ranch Hand. What makes these defoliants nasty from a human point of view, especially, is that they were not always contains these dioxins, which are very potent poisons, and unfortunately they contain the most potent one, that the so-called TCCD stuff. Now here is a map showing where in Vietnam they were deployed. They were only deployed in South Vietnam, and these areas marked with red are the ones where this was used. Some 13,000 square kilometers in all. So that gives you a kind of idea of the extent of this operation. So the consequences for the forest themselves was that both trees and especially what has been in retrospect the worst thing is that the seedlings were basically destroyed, and this caused erosion. So that has meant of the erosion of the soil, and that has meant that reforestation has been very difficult. One has not in practice been able to reconstitute these forests, and that has also had, of course, the consequence that the biodiversity of these areas has been reduced very sharply. Academic research has been concentrated on vertebrates, that is mammals, birds, amphibians only, and it's being reported that 80% of the species have disappeared from these areas. It has been very easy to do this research because the North Vietnam was never defoliated. So but there are very similar areas there, so one can compare the South Vietnamese and the North Vietnamese similar areas and just compare between them. To my knowledge, nobody has looked at what happened to insects, and other similar species. And so if there is any biologist listening to this one, here it would be a very topical topic of research. Now, consequences for the humans are mainly from these dioxins. They have been settled into the soil, and since they are very stable chemical compounds, they do not decay. They enter into the food chain and undergo these bioconcentration things. In certain species acquire more and more of them, so the concentration is increased, and of course the higher up you go into the food chain, the more of dioxins they will contain. We have the same problem in the Baltic Sea. Actually, dioxins were produced by the paper and pulp industry earlier. And the most heavily contained areas, which also some of it is due to spills, careless handling of these substances, are the former air bases. And for instance, the Ben Hua airfield close to former Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh town. Ho Chi Minh City is one of the worst areas. So these were my 3 examples of things how the military have been able to produce environmental catastrophes which we have to live with, or for, in some case, practically forever, like the nuclear fallout, or for centuries in these 2 other cases. Thank you very much, and I hope we can discuss this further. Stop share.
Okay, thank you, Klaus. Let me start the discussion with one question concerning dumping of chemical weapons in the Baltic Sea. As far as I know, the main problem is that in 1945, more than 1 million tons of ammunition was dumped in the Northern Sea and the Baltic Sea. And only a comparatively small part of the whole dumping contains chemical weapons. And first of all, there's the general problem that basically there is awareness about this time bomb in the sea, but we can say in reality nothing happens. And one very clear statement was made from a German member of parliament last year from this northern region, and he makes a statement to eliminate the whole waste of eroding ammunition in the Northern Sea and Baltic Sea. This would give us the opportunity for jobs about a time range of 80 years. But we have only 20 years time, nothing more. It's really a time bomb because the whole metal is eroding, and it's obviously that we have not a lot of time. And a more detailed question to you is it really a big percentage of chemical weapons? You know, the problem is if the authorities start to eliminate this ammunition and chemical weapon and all this stuff from the sea, there is only one institution in Germany who can eliminate chemical weapons with high temperature burning, and it's very very huge demand. but first of all, they have to identify whether it's only normal ammunition or really dangerous chemical weapons. And it would be interesting whether the awareness about this problem is in Finland more than in Germany and in the other countries on the Baltic Sea.
Oh yes, thank you for the question. You are completely right that also conventional ammunitions was dumped in large quantities, and I think you had a picture that in your introductory note. You can, since these containers are leaking, I mean, you can get a hint which is it chemical weapons or conventional weapons, because if you find these characteristic substances that emerge or are I mean, the chemistry is in some cases quite involved, but there are certain substances which can be used as marker substances, which are saying that there must be some chemical weapons dump close by. And also you can investigate the marine fauna on the bottom and find also look for the same markers in this fauna for seaweed, but also shellfish and the like. So in this respect, you can distinguish between these two. And of course, the chemical weapons, I did not talk about the conventional munition, which is in just in terms of absolute weight, a larger amount than the chemical weapons, because the danger is less, I would say, there. The really harmful substances or the more harmful substances come from the chemical weapons. Of course, the explosives are not completely harmless either. Certainly not.
Carl and Klaus, I would just like to add something. Agent Orange was also produced in Canada, actually by a factory, by a chemical company really close to where I live in Elmira, Ontario. And about 2 years ago, a 30-minute documentary came out about the production of Agent Orange in this country, and it's called Toxic Time Bomb. The video is free and you can watch it on YouTube. Not only was Agent Orange produced in Canada, it was also tested by the Canadian military and the US military in several locations in Canada, especially in New Brunswick. And in the 1980s and the 1990s and in the 2000s, soldiers who were adversely affected by the testing of Agent Orange and Agent Purple and Agent White in Canada banded together, and they forced the Canadian government to do an investigation. And that investigation and study led to payments that were made to affected soldiers in 2010. But for a very long time, the Canadian government refused to acknowledge that Canadian soldiers were affected and didn't release information. It required the persistence of journalists and lawyers to get the Canadian government to finally admit what happened. And there's an excellent book that was written in 2009 by a Canadian journalist named Chris Arsenault. It's called Blowback, a Canadian history of Agent Orange and the war at home. And then finally, I just want to mention that in 2019, the Canadian military released its very first environmental and energy strategy report. And in that report, it says that The Canadian military is one of the largest consumers of hazardous material in the country and one of the largest producers of hazardous waste in the country, and that most of the federal contaminated sites in this country are military sites. So absolutely, the Canadian military and militaries around the world are terrible for the climate, and they're terrible for the environment.
Yes, I only hope that that there are no dangerous waste dumps close to that factory you mentioned, because certainly there would be lots. One would expect that there would be lots of dioxins around there too.
Okay, what we have to be aware, what must be really clear, it's not a regional problem of the Baltic Sea. Of course, it's a special problem in the Baltic Sea, but it's a worldwide problem. You know, there are thousands of warships sunken in the oceans. I think mainly in the Atlantic Ocean, but also in the Pacific Ocean. And there was a lot of dumping of ammunition and chemical weapons in the Pacific Ocean after 1945. Also, example from Japanese chemical weapons. They had a lot of weapons or even in use, and it's really awful and a worldwide problem. But of course, it's much is very concentrated in the Baltic Sea.
I have a question to both, when possible.
Of course.
Okay, first of all, my question to Klaus is, Klaus, when something happened in the Baltic Sea and maybe in other places in the world, definitely we have environmental catastrophes. But have these environmental catastrophes also consequences for the climate change because of a huge amount of emissions which were free and that is my question to you. And to Tamara. Tamara, I think we had in the peace movements in some years a discussion about the exclusion of the military emissions in all the climate agreements and treaties. My question to you and maybe to all the others is, should we take an initiative in the preparation of the Glasgow Climate Summit at the end of this year to bring the military emissions and the military consequences for climate change more on the agenda? I'm saying this because I know that this is a very difficult question, because even our allies in the environmental movement are more than cautious to discuss these questions. But maybe it is really a job or a challenge for the peace movement to bring these topics on the agenda of the Glasgow Summit.
Okay, so
first, Klaus.
yes, there are of those three things that I mentioned, there are only indirect climate change effects. I mean, mainly from these defoliants, because they reduce the carbon sinks, I mean, growing forests, and so they have this large scale use of them has made large areas unsuitable for forest growth, and that means that less carbon is being absorbed in these regions compared to if they had been left alone, so to speak. Of the dumped ammunitions, I cannot see right off any connection with climate change. Well, neither for the radioactive fallout. But if somebody else has better insight into this, I will be happy to know.
Okay, Tamara.
Yes, Reiner, I absolutely agree with you. I think that peace activists should partner with environmental organizations and push the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change to include military emissions and exemptions on the agenda in the Glasgow meeting. And I think we should go further and call for a special report on the adverse impact of military emissions and military expenditures on global climate finance. The UN Green Climate Fund has kept military expenditures off their list as a source of potential funds and revenue to help with this big, green transition that we need. So military expenditures are always ignored as a source of funding. But I also think that we need to start having a conversation and forcing our governments at the national level to confront military emissions and exemptions, and to find out from our national governments what their plan is to offset all of these military emissions in order to get to these net zero commitments. So for instance, all of our countries, are buying these carbon intensive weapon systems, like my country, new fighter jets, new light armored vehicles, new warships, and the government is never considering, how many trees it's going to plant, or solar panels it's going to install to try to offset these emissions. So I think we've got to force them, because if we force them to confront this issue, then they're going to see that it's going to be extremely difficult and extremely costly to try to offset military emissions. And then the other point that I want to mention is we also have to start talking about the carbon budget, and how unfair it is that our Western developed countries are going to appropriate so much of the carbon budget, to power our militaries, when poor developing countries have they have inadequate fuel for development. They need massive resources because they're the hardest hit by the climate crisis. So, we need to make military emissions, central to this conversation that we're having about the climate crisis. I absolutely agree.
Okay. Further questions, remarks, and so on. Let me say one thing is clear. When we talk about environmental pollutants and the remainings of ammunition, chemical weapons, nuclear waste, and things like that, for mankind, it's necessary to spend a lot of money, and it's exactly this amount which would be necessary, which would be which is wasted in military spending. And to give one example, the military makes a lot of research to create automatic weapons, robots, for automated killings. But when robots are developed, these equipment must be used to clean up the sea from ammunition, chemical weapons. This is a job which can only be made with high technology, and this is an area where technology innovation would be necessary. But instead of that, technological innovation is wasted to create more dangerous and more effective killing weapons. Okay, further remarks, contributions?
Well, just one comment on the amount of military carbon emissions. We should, however, keep in mind that it's compared to the total civilian emissions, it's still not a very large fraction. I know the figures for Finland because the Finnish Department of Defense publishes exact figures from the use of fuel and others, and also estimate the total carbon emissions, and it's typically a few percent of the civilian emissions. And also, although it would be higher in NATO countries because they have a larger military activity, it's still, I would estimate, not much more than 5% of the total civilian emissions. So that should be kept in mind. Of course, it's a completely unnecessary emission. I agree with that. And everything should be cut that is possible to cut.
Klaus, are you sure when you are looking to the United States? I think the United States are the, 48th country. When the Pentagon would be a state, they were on the list of the 48th place or 49th place. Before Sweden and Portugal and other countries with the Pentagon emissions produced by Pentagon. So this is a quite high amount of emissions.
Quite, but the total amount of emissions in the United States is enormous.
Yeah, okay.
So yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Klaus, I totally agree. It's difficult to understand that in absolute figures, military is not the primary creator of greenhouse gases, but we have to see other figures, and these are the amount of greenhouse gases created from public services from the federal governments. And from Tamara, I got the information that from the whole services from the government, 60% is created, 60% of greenhouse gases is created by the military. And in Germany, I have researched and found out it's comparatively the same level. You have to see, for example, in Germany, there's a budget for public services with almost 100 billion euro, are the only public services from the federal government, and almost 50% of this budget is going to the military. And when you see how many people are occupied from the federal government, you can say, okay, it's almost 50% of all people from the federal government are military people. And then you can say the most greenhouse gases are created from the military. But at the same time, the federal government makes propaganda, says, okay, we know about the Sustainable Development Goals from the United Nations, and we do a lot. And look, we try not to to waste paper and to use only certified forest certified paper. Totally nonsense, but that they really don't care about the real failures in their own activities concerning greenhouse gases.
Carl, I would like to add that that report that Reinar is referring to, and Klaus, the Costs of War project report, Pentagon fuel use and climate change, she had to admit that she was using publicly the scant publicly available information that she could get. The U.S. military is not transparently disclosing its fuel use and its climate impacts. The other thing in that report, it did not include the climate impacts of the military's production and destruction of concrete, which there's many aspects of the climate impacts of the military that are not included in that report. We actually don't know the full extent of the problem. This is why we should be calling on the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the United Nations Environment Program, and all nation states to, fully and transparently disclose their military fuel consumption, their fuel costs, and their climate impacts. So we don't actually know the extent of the problem. The little that we do know, it's even worse. It's even worse.
Completely agree. In basically, although the United States fuel use is very accurately reported, and for instance, the Brown University report gives the figure for 2017 or 18, I don't know, these years, but they are annually actually reported. That's the United States is one of the few countries where you do get these actual figures for fuel use. Another country is Netherlands, and nowadays also since 2 years Finland.
I just want to add one other point to the Costs of War project report. When it says that the U.S. military is emitting 59 million tons of CO2, we also have to consider it on a per capita basis. So, at 59 million metric tons, it's bigger, yes, than Denmark, Finland and Sweden, but those populations are 10 million people, whereas the US military is just, 2 million people. So the footprint of a US soldier compared to, to a Dane or a Swede is 10 times bigger. It's massive. So we also have to think of it on a per capita basis. To have a soldier is so carbon intensive. So that's another aspect to think about. But we really need to start having the courage to say very publicly and loudly that we need to demilitarize to decarbonize. That's what we're really trying to do in Canada. We're trying to push politicians to start confronting this problem because they're all ignoring it. Even the Green Party in Canada, the New Democratic Socialist Party in Canada, they are ignoring the problem of military emissions and the environmental impacts of the military because it's considered a taboo to take on the military. But we have to change that. We can no longer ignore these terrible adverse impacts by militarism.
Okay, and when we talk about carbon footprint, we of course don't have a look only to fuel consumption, but we have to be aware that in the USA, 15% of industrial production is direct going to the military. And you can say that the percentage of military on greenhouse gases in industrial percentage is at least on this level. And of course, furthermore, there are more indirect impacts of greenhouse gases creation. That is that the whole globalized system is only possible to stand with the global militarization with 800 military bases and presence of the USA all over the world. And I think that's the main impact, that a globalized system which creates, which is created to waste resources and create greenhouse gases is only possible with this global militarization.
I think for getting better figures, we first of all have to define what do we mean under militarization, which include the militarization. And I think Karl-Heinz mentioned some points like military bases. But I also believe that all the military engagements, the interventional wars, the whole war on terror, with all the effects, is not included into the figures of the climate consequences of military. And and the second point is, independently from the concrete figures, I think we all know that militarization always means also in the world politics of confrontation. And this is again the opposite of cooperation, which we need to solve the climate problem.
Yeah.
So there are also political consequences. This is not only a technocratic pollution discussion. It has also political implications, because only global problems could be only solved under a climate of cooperation. And militarization, we can see this our day to day, is absolutely the opposite of this. So on one side, I think we need a more concrete discussion. What do we need under militarization and climate consequences? Because I think there are much more figures. I think no one really was thinking about what does this mean for military production, for military research, for military industry, including to get the resources for these productions. So, and on the other side, I think definitely we need a political argument of cooperation and confrontation to get the whole impact of military in the climate discussion.
Yeah, Rainer, I just want to add really quickly that I said in my presentation, and I just want to re-emphasize this, and I know that you know this very well, that NATO is the worst catalyst for militarism. It's militarizing the planet, and this is why I've started to go around Canada and saying we have to have the courage to call for the abolition of NATO because of its terrible climate and environmental impacts. We can't spend so much money on the military. We can't buy new military capabilities if we really care about the climate and the environment. It's just not compatible. So we also have to put NATO front and center as one of the worst culprits of the climate crisis, not just Exxon and the oil and gas companies. We also have to tackle the institution of NATO.
That is the reason we have a session in the afternoon about NATO.
Okay. I've announced to have a 90 minutes session, and my suggestion is we come to an end, and I hope we can use some things we have discussed for follow-up discussions, and that we keep in contact. And I myself that contact with Tamara for a longer time, and would be glad if I would keep in contact with Klaus, because this special problem, Baltic Sea, chemical weapons and munition, is a really burning problem. And so I hope it was very useful to come together in this workshop. Okay, then let me close this workshop.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Bye, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.